Hey, Curran, welcome back. So today we're doing parts 2 and 3. So today we're going to discuss data protection trends and opportunities for higher engagement on your cold outreach campaigns. So welcome to the marketing automation discussion. Let's begin. All right, so data protection trends, opportunities for higher engagement. What do marketers need to know about the general data protection regulation in the EU? Curran is in Berlin, Germany. He's the CEO of HubSell, and he's my co-host because he's an expert in cold outreach, and he is very familiar with the GDPR and remaining compliant. So why don't you take this slide, Curran?
Yep. Thank you, Alex. I'll say it again, the expert is our legal counsel. And as I've said earlier, exactly, I'll source my expert on one of our podcasts so we can really deep dive, not only with GDPR, but also the e-privacy regulation that is going to be applicable, I believe, from 2019. It's going to be a blanket level regulation for the European Union, and it will regulate the cold outreach. A lot of interesting things are happening there. I think we'll discuss that in one of the follow-up podcasts, but let's dive right into this slide right now. GDPR. It's applicable to companies that are in any way targeting, keeping data of, interacting with European citizens. So as long as your market has even a proportion of it focusing on European Union citizens, you are going to need to apply GDPR friendly policies in your companies and practices. Right? Now, it doesn't just apply to you, but also to any person in your supply chain, any supplier or any processor within your entire supply chain that works on the data that includes European citizen data. Right? So when you think about compliance, you can't just hedge yourself against it and say, all right, everything else is fine. You need to actually make sure that your third-party processors, your basically entire supply chain is also compliant at the same time. Now, the cost for breaching, the one amount that is listed on the screen right now, $20 million or 4% of the worldwide annual revenue. This is the second level breach. The first level breach, I believe, is going to net you a fine of up to 10 million or 2% of your global revenue. Now, so far, we haven't seen any fine being handed out. That also has to do with the fact that the GDPR interpretation is evolving. I think it will be updated in the coming months as companies end up breaching the GDPR and how judges, let's say, provide a fine or a punishment based on what these companies did. So there's a lot more that we should cover in the coming months on the GDPR. Now, GDPR provides, let's say, unavoidable rights to the data subject, right? These rights have to do with their control on the data that you have on them. Basically, they should be able to access their data in your database. So you need to make that happen. You need to enable the data subject or a customer or prospect, all different names, but in the legal language, it's a data subject. They should be able to access their data. They should be able to edit their own data, erase or unsubscribe their data from your database, and prevent any kind of transfer of the data. So GDPR makes sure that the controller, the person that actually has control over their data, is the data subject. And taking all these points together, you want to include that in your scope. So get data that you need, that you can legitimately show a business interest in, right? And make sure that your processing is fitting that scope and purpose. So basically, first have your scope ready, what the purpose of the data is, what do you need, what variables do you need, how you're going to use them. All of that should be done, and then you go around getting data and processing it. Right?
Yep. Yeah, and I'll just reiterate the part about third-party processors. So anyone that touches your data, this could be obviously your email provider, but then they have sub-processors below them. So anyone that touches your data, you are inevitably responsible for that. So making sure that they are all compliant. There are a lot of managed email services out there, a lot of startups, a lot of people just trying to do things for other companies that are not compliant, not maintaining data warehousing under a compliant manner or in a compliant manner. So make sure, triple check, know who's got your data, when, and how they're using it. All right, so moving on. We are on a slide, if you're listening, that's titled What's Great About GDPR. This is important because obviously GDPR has been somewhat of a headache for a lot of companies, multinational companies and companies targeting EU citizens. It's required them to do a lot of infrastructure changes, personnel changes, getting ready for this May 25th deadline that has passed when we're recording now. But on the marketing side specifically, and on the sales side, we believe that this is a good thing, and here's why. So number one, there is a new increased customer confidence to leave their data on your site. So when someone goes to your site and sees just a contact form that has really not much to say about what's happening with their data, me as a customer, I don't really feel comfortable leaving my data. Not only pre-GDPR with less regulations, but just the fact that I don't really know what you're doing with my data. So under GDPR, you're required to tell the customer exactly what's happening with the data that you're asking for. So if you're asking for an email, you have to tell them that I'm going to send you marketing collateral. I'm going to send you specifically stuff about this. Leave your email, check this box, and opt in. So an increase in customer confidence. So this should be good. The people that are leaving their email will not be offended when you start sending a marketing material because they've opted in. Now there's less noise in the inbox. There's fewer bad practices happening. So those who are not taking the time to become GDPR compliant are not going to be able to send their mass bulk, non-customized, non-one-to-one outreach sequences. They're not going to be able to spray and pray, practice this shotgun method of marketing. They're going to have to get focused. They're going to have to remain compliant. They're going to have to get opt-ins. So if you are someone that's practicing compliant outreach, you will be the focus in the inbox. You will have a lot less competition for the viewer's attention. So that's another positive. Number three, abiding to GDPR means you are focused on becoming a valuable marketer and a precise marketer. So similar to number two, you are now required to segment your data, to focus your marketing campaigns, to supply only the messaging that someone actually opted in for to them, which means tagging, bucketing, segmenting, becoming the marketer that we all should be. We should have been, at least. This means higher conversion rates per campaign, more knowledge of who's in your database, and just a better overall marketing strategy. The next slide, if you're listening, we're looking at a quote. So, Kern, why don't you read the quote and explain kind of anything you want to touch on around that?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. The quote says, segmented email campaigns have an open rate that is 14% higher than non-segmented campaigns. And click-through rates are 101% higher in segmented email campaigns than non-segmented campaigns. Now, this is very, very clear. Obviously, when your data as well as your outreach is very targeted, and this can be achieved through segmentation. The narrower your segmentation becomes, the more targeted, the more relevant, and if you planned it within your copy, more valuable your content will be to the end recipient.
And this goes back to our point about what's good about GDPR. You have to segment your campaigns, which allows you to be specific in your subject line and specific in your email copy. You can use dynamic text regardless, but knowing who that email is specifically going to and bucketing them accordingly allows you to be more precise with your messaging and get higher open and click-through rates. So next section here, section number 3, the last section of this presentation, is titled What Now? Gaining, Using, and Protecting Data. The next slide, if you're listening, is a image of a outreach cycle. So what happens from beginning to end? Step 1, you're acquiring data and you're cleansing that data. So you're verifying the data. You're going through the process of data enrichment. Step 2, that data goes into your CRM or whatever you're using to manage your data. Step 3, and this actually could possibly happen before entering your CRM, but you want to segment that data. So you want to tag the contacts accordingly. You want to bucket them accordingly. Step 4, you take action on the data. So this could be advertisements first. We talked about in previous episodes retargeting based on the data. It's called CRM retargeting. It could involve some sort of a touch point on social. So a follow, a connect, a like, a connection request, and then obviously any sort of messaging, cold messaging on LinkedIn, cold outreach via email, whatever you want to do to take action. And then step 5, analyze the data. So find out what happened, what touch points worked. Hopefully you A/B tested some stuff and you have some good data to go ahead and act on. And then it starts over. You resegment the data based on the analysis, retag based on the analysis, scrub based on the analysis, start the process over again. Now the next slide is titled Data Gathering or Enrichment Action Items. So Karan, why don't you touch on the first 3 and then I'll go ahead and wrap it up with that last one.
Yeah, absolutely. This ties in really well with the previous slide as well, and ties in with the compliance to GDPR. What it says is gather data only after you know why and what. It's another way of saying know your purpose, know what you're going to do with it, and gather what you need. But that also automatically makes you be very, very accurate about the data that you need. Define your market, define your segment, define the purpose of your campaign, then go and get that data that you need. You need to know what you're going to do with that data. Let's say you want to reach out to people on Twitter as well as LinkedIn. You're going to need to get their LinkedIn social media URLs. You're going to need their Twitter handles. You're also going to need their address if you want to include a physical letter to a company, to a prospect in a company. So all of these steps in a particular campaign will tell you what data that you need. And then you need data that allows you to bucket the people into different smaller subsets. Depending on what you're selling, depending on what you want to achieve, what your use case is, there could be different categorical data that you can use to structure your data further into smaller sets. An example of that could be the seniority of a particular person in a company. Now, if you are focusing on getting in touch with departmental heads, and your message will be altered depending on who you're targeting, then you might want to have this information as part of your gathering process. That you want to know what is their seniority in their particular company, or what department they are heading, for example. That could be interesting as well. In some European countries, well, actually, pretty much all continental European countries, the languages that are here rely on gender information for certain grammatical changes. So you could say one sentence with verb conjugations in one way to a male and in another way to female. So that information could also be relevant if you're targeting a European country, for example. So coming back to know what you're going to do and then find out what you're going to acquire in terms of data. Then verify, making sure your information is actually valid. Let's say that taking the same example again, the email address, the address, the social media links, are they actually correct? Need to be sure about that. Let's take an example. If your emails are 30% wrong, that bounce rate is going to cripple the entire campaign, right? Not only did you decrease the overall market, the overall population of that particular sample by 30% to 70% only, that is going to impact your spam rating. So you might just end up having an open rate of about 10-15%, which you could have had, let's say, in the range of 50 to 60% if you had done the data collection accurately and the validity of your data was high, right?
Mm-hmm.
Also ties in really well with point number 3, only collect and maintain what you need. One of the mandates of GDPR will make you become more specific in your data treatments, right? If you know what you're going to collect, if you can verify what you've collected, and if you only collected what you needed, obviously it would be a waste of money to collect more than what you need. You're kind of satisfying all 3 main points that we are trying to promote here in this podcast.
The last point there is internally run data mapping exercise. So this is something I believe in. I think it's necessary now with GDPR, but what you want to create is actually a visual. Use maybe your UI tool or use some sort of a mind map tool, or just draw it on a whiteboard. But have some sort of a visual showing where your data is coming from. An example of that is, I have purchased data lists from the past sitting in my Google Drive, right? I have in my CRM data from conventions that I grab business cards from, or I have data from a prospecting activity, or I have data from my opt-in forms. So you have all these different data sources coming into your repository, your CRM. But you also may have another repository that could just be a general database. It could be your event capture software. It could be your cold email software. So you have all these repositories. Then those go out to sub-processors. So maybe data skips a repository and goes into a sub-processor like a managed email provider, and it does not enter your CRM yet. So you grab your data from some sort of a data provider, it skips your repository and it goes to your sub-processor. Then that sub-processor may have some people working for them, another company, either a verification, or maybe they use a tool like Hubcell. But creating that whole entire visual map, it could look like a sort of a bubbled map with lines in between each, showing where the data is flowing. This is a good practice, not just to be able to show new hires on your data team or on your marketing team what's going on, but also to show auditors if you're in the EU, saying, hey, this is what we know about our data. We've taken the time to make sure that we know what's happening with our data. And further, you may notice some things that you forgot about when you did this research. So it's an exercise internally to make sure you know everything that's going on with your data, and you can also remain compliant and help new hires and new people on the team get a very good awareness of what's happening. So I believe in creating that internal data mapping exercise. Now, moving on, the next slide, we're almost done here, is called campaign action items. Karan, since you've got some cool stuff going on specific to this, why don't you explain what these 3 mean?
Sure, yeah. Adding a social impression, that's point number 1. Hopefully automated social impression. Could be anything from ranging from following somebody on Twitter, sending them a connection request on LinkedIn, or just visiting their profile or following them to get their content. These are low touch social impressions, but you can also go a little bit further. The main point behind it is email at this moment has too much noise. And if you're just focusing, let's say you've done all the good data work that you needed to do, and now you can reach out, why limit it to one channel? Spread into the social channel as well. So once you have the data, make sure you maximize its value to you by creating campaigns that are not, let's say, single channel, but rather multi-channel or even omni-channel. And social, obviously, is a very, very powerful channel. In B2B, you have LinkedIn, of course, and in certain countries, Twitter is very powerful in B2B. You have Facebook and Instagram for B2C. And make sure that you, in some way, tap into the power of these and create campaigns that orchestrate a multi-channel outreach for you. And if you can do this automatically, if you have a software that you deploy that does it in an automatic way, even better. Point number 2, by the way, Alex, did you want me to cover all 3 points or just the first?
Yeah, go ahead and cover all three.
Perfect. Now, segment your data based on opt-in versus opt-out requirement states. That's point number two. Now, this ties in really well with the GDPR. Now, as I said earlier, that e-privacy state regulation, so the e-privacy regulation, which is currently still under commenting by the European Council as well as the European Parliament. They need to come to an agreement between making the entire Europe opt-in or opt-out, and differentiating between B2B and B2C, and determining if that's going to be opt-in or opt-out. Until that point, European states and all the other states in the world are also having their own regulation, which are which explain whether or not a particular outreach, in this case, let's say cold calling or emailing or faxing or sending letters, all of that, is it opt-in or opt-out? Keep that as part of your planning, right? If you want to be compliant, and being compliant is even more important now than it was 2 months ago, make sure that you're able to clearly see what part of your data, for what part of the action of that campaign is an opt-in requirement versus an opt-out requirement. Will save you a lot of unnecessary risk, and will also make the results better. Now, finally, separating your cold outreach from your normal outreach, they are inherently very different. Cold outreach has the main focus to establish contact. Establish dialogue between the party that is executing that campaign with the party that is receiving that campaign's content. So it should not be mixed up with inbound or, let's say, other tools. Have a dedicated software that is doing it so that you do it right. Softwares that can take care of that data, can segment that data, and allow you to create, let's say, human-like campaigns. Yeah, so being able to separate that data for that clear purpose further adds to the points that we've discussed so far.
Yeah, and I think in part one and a couple other episodes, we talk about specifically why a cold outreach tool is best for cold outreach. Not only the name and the purpose, but the way the tool is set up. You know, the different features of the tool. We don't have to go into that now, but check back and look at the older episodes for more specifics on why using a cold outreach tool is better than your typical outreach, your MailChimps, your campaign monitor, your MailJets, your SendGrids of the world. So moving on.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
One thing I will say, which is part of this presentation, and perhaps the listener had a few days in between when they listened to the first and the second. So just to bring this thought fresh in their head, in part one, we discuss about being omnipresent and human-like. Mm-hmm. And if you want to satisfy both of those requirements, you will definitely need a very, very dedicated tool, and have high-quality data that is segmented and bucketed and so forth. Just to add to the point that you were making there, Alex.
Yep. Awesome. Yeah, definitely. Good point. And definitely check back in that first part of the presentation, and then a couple other episodes back. There's some really good focused questions about that. And final slide here, we just have some statistics to talk about. But you know, at this point, if you've watched the first section and you watched the second section, hopefully you are on the same page. You know, it takes a lot of touch points to connect with a prospect, not just one, not just a really good cold email. They have to have seen your face. They have to know who you are. They have to really understand what you're up to. And it can't just be a very well written single cold email. Sometimes that works, but you know, it's unlikely that just a single cold email will get their attention. So multiple touch points, multiple cold emails in the sequence, some logic in between, and some thought and some psychology in between to make sure you're putting the best sequence out there. You know, how much time is spent prospecting. So if you're listening in, we have 34% is how much time spent. talking to prospects. So, again, you just want to be very cognizant of your prospect and how much information they have from you during this whole outreach process. And the last stat there, 41% is the average percentage that dynamic copy outperforms static. And Karan, why don't you finish us off with an explanation of what that means?
Sure. I'll also say a few things about each of these. I can give examples. I've seen examples with customers for each of these. We have a customer in the US that I recommended that they send, I think, seven different touch points, and they were sending only 4. And they were getting a lot of replies on the 4th, but they were missing out on the replies that they would have gotten on 5, 6, and 7. And then they did. Their call-set ratio immediately increased by a lot. Time spent talking to prospects, this should be ideally 90%. You want to talk to your prospects. This is what salespeople do really well. They are excellent human, let's say, interaction specialists. You want your salespeople to be constantly talking to their prospects, converting these into opportunities, and then your account managers converting those opportunities into sales, right? That's ideally what you want. And this 34% means all of that other time, 66% is just spent on things which are not necessarily what salespeople want to do or are excellent at, right? Let those other things be done by other people, other softwares, other support staff. Salespeople should be focusing on prospect, having conversations, and developing opportunities. The final statistic that we have there, the average percentage that dynamic copy outperforms static, has to do with the ability of dynamic copy to not only provide relevant content, which is valuable, but also be able to, first of all, it increases the open rate, because you can use dynamic copy also mostly in subject line. So you get more people to open. And with dynamic copy, you'll be able to provide them with let's say, the content that is specifically valuable to them. Not necessarily them as a unit, as a company, as a department, but rather them as a person. Obviously, if your copy is targeted to them, if when they read it, they see a clear difference between your copy and all the other cold emails they receive on a weekly basis, the answer is clear who they're going to respond to, right? And that's why dynamic copy, and really, really good salespeople can use dynamic copy to create emails which are indistinguishable from emails written by hand while looking at that company's profile or that person's profile. And that's really the level you can achieve, and it by far outperforms static copy.
Yeah, and I just showed on screen that email that we mentioned in presentation 1, how to do it correctly. So there's a visual for you of a good dynamically written email with some if-then statements, a personal note, company and sender information. So anyways, that is that. So that's part 2 and 3. Definitely, if you have not watched part 1, go ahead and watch or listen to part 1. Keep in touch. We'll be on again probably early next week for another episode about marketing automation, data protection, compliance, and quality. So thank you again, Karan, for the time, and let's touch base offline.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alex. Take care.
Have a good week.